When I was 19, I moved to London to start a new job in the area where I still live now. I haven't moved very far since then. I'd been down to the area about 3 months before. I wanted to go and see the job that I was going to be working in, to see if I could find somewhere to live and to find a church that I could connect with in this new area. And I found a church, a leader of that church, and I'd rung him and said, can I meet you for lunch and just hear about your church? And so then on my first Sunday when I arrived, I went to that church, and it was a small church, about 40 people in a small hall. It was my first time, and Peter, the man who was leading the church at that time, said something like, "Paul's here today, it's his first Sunday, make him welcome." Almost immediately there was a hand on my shoulder and a stranger's voice said, "You're coming back to our house for lunch." And so I had no other plans. I went back with that family for lunch in their home that day. And it was an average size house. It was a couple who'd been married a few years. They had a baby and I think another one on the way. They had 2 children from a previous marriage who were there that day as well. It was actually a family birthday celebration, and it was a fantastic roast dinner. And so there I was, invited back for lunch, but I wasn't just invited into a house. I was actually invited right into the middle of that home and that family celebration. They didn't just open their table to me, they didn't just open their house to me. In that day, they opened their lives to me. And in just those few hours, I think we learnt so much about each other that we would never have learnt if we had not been eating together in that way. Peter had said, "Make him welcome." They certainly did that for me that day. And in an incredibly powerful way, I think, to a young guy of 19, in a new place, knowing no one, eating round a table, they demonstrated something to me. It was like they were saying, this is family, this is home. Now that was 1984. And that small church went through many changes. It went through some changes of people, it went through changes of name, and today it's what we call Doxa Community Church. There are a number of reasons why I am part of this church today. But a big reason for me still is this, that 37 years ago, a couple called David and Helen, who didn't know me, invited me to their home to eat with them. And they said to me, this is family. And so I want to talk this morning a little bit about what that looks like. If we're a family, we eat together. Let me tell you another story that I've heard about. And this is a true story. It actually happened. There was a church and there were about 100 people in that church. And they were so excited about what they discovered about Jesus that they couldn't stop talking about it. And in a single day, one day, in response to that, 3,000 people came to know Jesus. They said, we want to know what Jesus is like too. Wow, can you imagine that? Wouldn't that be great if that was a story of Doxa Community Church? Now, I can't see you, I can't hear you where you are now, but I imagine that there are rooms listening to this that are cheering at that point. But maybe you missed it. What if a church of just over 100 people could see 3,000 people added in a single day? Wouldn't that be incredible? I mean, it would raise a few questions. There'll be things we'd have to ask. We might say, who's going to lead and teach a group like that? Where would we even meet? And how would we find time in our busy days to even meet together and get to know each other? There would be lots of practical things that you would begin asking. I want to call those the easy stuff. Easy because this is a story of something that happened in a real church. It's a true story. And so we can simply say, well, what did they do in response to that? How did they deal with that? And see if we could do something similar. Wouldn't that be easy? So what is the easy stuff? Who would lead a group like that? Well, the answer would be those believers, you and me. Where would they meet Well, the answer might be, well, in our homes, those places that we have already. How would we find time? Well, that would be easy. What if we were to meet together over a meal, somewhere that we already were, doing something that we were already doing? Because that is what this church in this story did. It's what the first church did. And we can read about this in Acts 2. And so if you've got a Bible, let's read about this church and their experience and how they handled this phenomenal growth and how they began to meet and the part that was played in that story of being a family and eating together. And so in Acts 1 verse 15 it says this: in those days Peter stood up among the believers, and those believers at that time were about 120 people. And jump forward a little bit further, Acts 2 verse 41. And those who had accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 people were added to that number that day, in a single day. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and to fellowship, and to breaking of bread, and to prayer. And everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And all the believers were together, and they had everything in common. And they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So here's a story. Here's a church in Acts of 120 believers. In a single day, 3,000 new people are added. Those first few verses in 42 and 43, they tell us what they did. They devoted themselves to teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. And then in verse 44 to 46, it tells us how they did it. They did it daily by sharing their lives inside their homes, outside the temple, eating together, something so simple and so practical. And as a result of that, there was this incredible growth in praise, growth in favour, and growth in numbers. And so I just want to let's look at 4 simple thoughts about eating together. I want us to look at how eating together is relational hospitality. I want to look how eating together is a principle for growth. I want to look at what eating together does in terms of breaking bread. And I want to look at eating together in terms of our lives and what we might call lordship, how we see our lives working out together. Romans 12 verse 13 says this: meet the needs of the saints and practice hospitality. If we think about opening homes and eating together, it may be that word that we think about, hospitality. The word comes from a Latin origin, a word hospice. And really it's a word that describes a shared experience. It's not about something you do for someone else. It's about something you share in together. It may have been the picture that there's a traveller, someone is coming through, and as they stop off at some place, they need a warm fire, they need some food, and as they sit together with the host and the guests around this fire sharing food, hospice is what takes place. It's a shared experience. The stories are told and experiences shared around a meal together for this person. Hospitality is not something we give, it's something we share in together. That's the origin of that word. I grew up in a home where my parents had a very open house. There was often people staying. It wasn't unusual to come home from school and be told, you're sleeping in a different place tonight because we've got guests. It wasn't unusual to have a meal table with other people invited at that table, and all kinds of people. And I can remember at different points, some of these people were exciting guests. They had stories to tell of adventurous lives. They may have been someone who's been in some form of ministry. They may have been a missionary who lived overseas, but they had stories to tell. And in those meal times, it was a shared experience. We sat round tables and we listened, and I can remember exciting moments as we listened to conversations and heard what God had done in people's lives, how he'd led them, how he'd answered prayer. There were times of a shared experience of hospitality. They happened around a time that we would be sitting there anyway. I mean, there would be 6 of us in the family. We would be sitting around the table eating. People were just invited into that family space, and we shared that experience together. They were exciting times. They were inspiring times. You know, hospitality doesn't have to be fine dining. I mean, if that is your thing and you love cooking and doing a spread, then go for it. What a tremendous blessing and treat that is for someone who comes for a meal. But it can just be a cup of tea and a conversation, a shared experience as we eat together and we encourage and we are encouraged. You know, in this early church, it says that they met daily and ate in their homes. There's no real pattern of what a church should look like then. They were making this up as they went along. They had a number of elements that they wanted in place. You know, they wanted there to be these components of teaching, of fellowship, of breaking of bread and of prayer. But how would you build that into a life? Well, it would be building it into these moments they could share together. And often that was in a home and eating together around a meal. You know, as we think about COVID and where we are as a church now, what's happening across lots of churches, things are different. It's like we're having to rebuild again from what we were to what we can become. There's a way we might need to rethink what are the key components and how can we see those worked out. If there's one thing that I think is needed now, it's hospitality. These moments when we can get together again. You know, when we went from this place where you can't meet together and you've got to be physically distanced, and now suddenly you can have 6 people together in a home, what an opportunity that we can now begin to meet. What does that look like, that principle of meeting together, of connecting relationally? How do we do that in a church? How do we make it not just about the food? It's not even about who's going to host and who's the guest. It's just about moments when we can come together, when we can practice hospitality, when we can share food, when we can eat together, but also where we can share our lives, where we can have questions. How are you? Moments. Just seeing how you are. Can we listen to what our experiences have been? Can we encourage? Are there times we can pray into that? And it's not just about finding time. You might look at a busy diary and think, how do we find time to meet with people? Well, find the time when you already sit at a table. Could we invite somebody into that space when we're already doing something like that? Could that be an encouragement? Who might you invite into that space? You want to take a moment now and think, who is there who I know, who I think about, who I could just ring this week and say, would you like to come round and share a meal with us? You know, it doesn't even have to be a long time. You could say, you know, we do tea 6 till 7. Would you like to join us 6 to 7? Could we in that time eat together? Can we have these moments of conversation? Can we have this hospice? This moment of a shared experience when we understand where we're at. We have a moment when we can pray and listen to one another over a simple meal, something we might be already doing. It may be there's someone who's in the church family and you think, I just want to begin to connect with people again. Is hospitality something that could work here? It may be that you've got a friend or a neighbour or a relative who you just haven't seen for a while, but you want to invite them into your home to share this experience too. You know, maybe you get an invite like that and someone says, we're eating 6 to 7, would you like to join us? I mean, don't think, well, that's a bit short and sweet. It's as if they can't wait to get rid of me. What a blessing that we can just be together. It doesn't have to be long, but we're taking steps. We want to practice hospitality. We want to see how this works and then use that time really well. Eat together, laugh together, like these early church believers were doing. Enjoy that time together. Have those how are you moments. And it may be in that there's some other consideration. Maybe there's something practical that comes out, that there's some way that you can bring blessing together into those circumstances. We're invited to practice hospitality. Wouldn't it be great if during this time, as we think relationally, what does relational hospitality look like in this church family, that we could be a family who eat together? And the second thing I want to talk about is growth. How does eating together link with growth? We've read that there's this early church, and this is how they did it. That's how they were able to meet in each other's homes. Now, I can't tell you that I've got a guaranteed way that I can see a church of just over 100 people grow to 3,000 in a single day. I mean, I would love to see God work so powerfully in us and through us that we see that happen. What an amazing thing that would be. But what I can give you is 2 guaranteed ways of seeing a church family double in size on one Sunday this month. If we were to listen to this and take it to heart and think how we can do it. So are you up for that? I wonder if you're up for seeing that. Can we be part of a story that says a church family could double in size on one Sunday this month? Remember, this is the easy stuff. It involves you, involves me, involves our homes, and a shared meal. It's not a new idea, it's an old idea. So who do you know? Who is the somebody at this time that you speak to? Who is it that you are praying for right now? Who is it who's not in the church, who you might invite to your home next Sunday to watch church together and have a croissant and coffee afterwards? Is there someone you could just ask, would you like to come to breakfast church with our family? We're inviting you. Who might that be? Is that something you could do this week? What if we all did that? We would see a church of just over 100 people double in size on a single Sunday. But what about this? Who is it you know? Who is it that you are speaking to? Who is it that you are praying for? Who you might say, would you come to our family picnic on the 22nd of August? We're inviting you. We'd love you just to bring some food and sit with us and join in our family time together. What if we all did that? You know, conversations open when we open our lives to people in this way. Opportunities to pray open when we open our lives in this way. But I think this eating together is not just about numerical growth. We grow in knowing God as we eat together and as we speak together. Like those times when I was growing up and I listened to stories of speakers and missionaries and guests in our home who inspired me. I can remember one particular couple. They were missionaries right out in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, they lived halfway around the world and they told such amazing stories of how they'd seen God at work. 30 years ago, I was blessed to have a job in Hong Kong. And when that job finished, I realised I was able to travel for a couple of months before I came back to the UK. And I went to those islands. I visited 6 islands. I never dreamt I'd ever go to those places, but I was able to meet up with those missionaries in the places that as a child I'd heard them talk about and actually see for myself what God was doing in some incredible places in the world. There are times when we speak together and we hear what God is doing, that it encourages us and we grow through that. You know, when I was young, I used to get invited to some ladies. I think I was 18 at the time, and they owned the small cottage that I rented where I was working. And they used to tell me incredible stories of answered prayers in their lives. And I can remember that for me, it stirred faith. It made me believe that I could see my prayers answered. Sometimes I think when we eat together, there's a space where miracles can happen. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus' first miracle took place at a party. It was in an environment of food and drink where people were enjoying being together. I think when we open our homes, when we open our lives in this way, we can see growth, not just in people coming and being invited in, but our own lives growing in our knowledge of God and being blessed. The third thing I want to talk about is how eating together links with breaking bread. It says about this early church, they devoted themselves to the teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread and to prayer. And I want to talk about breaking bread. You know, when we hear that term breaking bread, we probably immediately think of a communion meal and bread and wine, this sacrament, the celebration, this almost a ritual that we have seen done in church again and again and again. And we read about this church in Acts, this early church devoting themselves to it. They did it daily in their homes. I think it does talk about the communion meal, but it talks about so much more than that. You know, in Bible times, bread was the main food item. It would be something that would be eaten at every meal. every day. Remember when the disciples say to Jesus, will you teach us how to pray? What does Jesus say? Give us this day our daily bread. Bread would have been something that was at the table every day, every mealtime. It kept well. If you were travelling somewhere, you took bread with you. It was something that was there every day, visible. You would see it repeatedly throughout the day. It would be in these homes. And the bread wasn't cut, it was broken. That was how you would serve it. Bread was also a picture of God's blessing of his sustenance, how he keeps his people. And so there's so much in this term bread. In fact, even bread and breaking bread wasn't just used by Jesus at the time he had the Last Supper. Way back in the Bible, the term breaking of bread is used. And in Lamentations 4, there's a verse, Lamentations 4 verse 4. It says this, the children are hungry for bread and no one is breaking it to them. I don't know whether you've ever seen on a building site where they're demolishing buildings and they'll have a crane and it will have a wrecking ball. And that ball swings and it demolishes that building, it knocks it down. When I read this verse and I was preparing some of these notes, this verse hit me like a wrecking ball. I think the Bible's got a number of wrecking ball verses. You might have some in your life. Maybe we'll do a series one day on wrecking ball verses, things that are these powerful statements that get our attention, stop us in our tracks, and we begin to say, God, what are you wanting to say to me through this? The children are hungry for bread, and no one is breaking it to them. Jesus took, at that Last Supper, just these ordinary items on the table. He took bread that was always going to be there every meal, and he took wine and he broke it, and he said, this is my body, broken for you. It brings wholeness to you. We often talk in church about things that we want to see God's power transform, reaching people who are lost, healing pain, restoring brokenness. The answer to all of that is in Jesus. And just recently we spent a little bit of time thinking as a leadership team about church and what church looks like and where we go with things and what God is speaking to us for the next season that we're in. And we began asking about what are the lostness and the pain and the brokenness. And I think we reached this point that Jesus has put an answer to all of that. There is an answer to lostness. There is an answer to pain. There is an answer to brokenness. And we celebrate it in this act of breaking bread. All that Jesus said he had done. The cross was a success. We teach this all the time. It is finished. There are things we repeat again and again and again. That is an answer to all the things we see around us. I've often said, and people who know me well will know, I'll often say, I don't ask what are the needs around us. I mean, I am bothered by the needs around us, and we respond through projects in so many ways, but I try and ask the question a different way. What does it look like when God moves into the neighbourhood? What does it look like when a broken body is there, when we break bread and we say there is an answer in Jesus to all these things? There's a man in our church today, such a blessing to me to hear him speak. But my first conversation with him, some while ago, he said, I want to know who Jesus is. He was hungry for bread, but no one had broken it for him. Last week, there was a young man in our house. He's interested in going to church. He's been in London for 2 years. He doesn't quite know which church to go to and how you find one and whether it will be what he's looking for, whether he'll get a welcome, whether he'll be over-welcomed. He's hungry for bread, but nobody's broken it to him. I believe that around each one of us, there are people who are hungry for bread and nobody's broken it for them. We have this incredible good news. We have this incredible message. We have this story of an early church who broke bread daily in their homes. There's something about the importance of what Jesus has done that comes and impacts every part of our lives and through us begins to impact those people around us. Breaking bread in our homes is this. It is bringing the reality of what Jesus has done into every area of our everyday lives. And it's done by eating together. There are children who are hungry for bread, and nobody has broken it to them. I wonder if there's people that you need to be breaking bread in your homes with today. I wonder if there's people in your workplaces that you need to be breaking bread with. I mean, have a meal together and somehow in that meal and conversation, talk about the reality that you know, that you live out, of Jesus in your life, how he is the answer to so many things. A shared meal, the breaking of bread. There are people who are hungry for bread all around us, and no one's breaking it to them. Let's be people who break bread in our homes. Let's eat together in that way. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about lordship. Eating together says something. These shared meal times together, they're a recognition that God is our provider. It's why we say grace before a meal. Thank you, God, for this food. But there's more than food in our homes. There's the home itself that we're meeting in. There are moments every day when we can just be thankful. God, you just provide all that I need. You give us the food to live, but you also are the strength of our life too. We want to recognise that as we eat together. And so these early believers, they met together in their homes. They ate meals together in their homes. They shared these meals together and they opened their lives together. In those conversations, they discovered that there might be somebody who had a need. And they began to explore how they could meet that need. Someone said, I've got something I can sell here, and it can meet that. Somehow in this shared moment, this food, this eating together, this conversation, this recognition that God is ultimately the provider of everything, it allowed them to be a group of people who had everything in common, who shared, but they discovered it as they ate together, that he was Lord, he was the provider, he was the sustainer, he was the God whose promises, he says, are true. And they began to explore so much more from that meal table. You know, the Bible is full of pictures of food, of eating together, the idea of a feast. I can think of so many verses in the Bible where God is almost inviting us to feast with him. As a family, we eat together. But we are invited to a feast with God. That there's a table laid out for us to come and feast. There's an interesting thought that in the Bible, feasting will always follow sacrifice. There was always a sacrifice first, and then there was a feast. I wonder if we've ever really thought about that. And Jesus invites us to come and feast with him. One of the verses that I really like is in Psalm 37, and it says this: keep trusting in the Lord and do what is right in his eyes. Fix your heart on the promises of God, and you will dwell in the land, feasting on his faithfulness. We've got a God who is so good, who is so faithful, and he invites us to come and just feast on his faithfulness. It's a verse that speaks about our head, our hands, and our heart. Trust in God. Set your mind on that. Do what is right. What has God called us each to do? Fix your heart on him and on his promises. You'll find yourself dwelling in a land and feasting on his faithfulness. You know, these are words written by David in his older life. These are lived out words. These are words that are his experience over a long life of saying, this is what I have discovered. We can feast on the faithfulness of God. We can trust in him. He helps us do what's right in his eyes, our hearts fixed on his promises. I want to encourage you. I want to nick a phrase from Jan. He often says, you know, work with these things when you hear things. I'd invite you to go away this week. Read that passage in Acts 2 about the church. Read about what they did. They devoted themselves to these things. And this is how they did it. Daily opening their lives to each other. And seeing as they did that, that there was ways of practicing hospitality, relationally building together. There was ways of seeing growth in themselves and through them. There was ways of them powerfully telling the story of what Jesus had done in their lives with another person, breaking bread in their homes, and a recognition that God is Lord, that it's all from him. Let's feast on his faithfulness this week.